horloge hier neerleggen, dan weet ik wanneer we moeten afronden.
Ja.
Ja, okay. So we're here today in the Global Methane Pavilion at COP26 in Glasgow, and I'm very pleased to have with me Mr. Mark van Heukelen, who is the Ambassador at Large for Climate Diplomacy for the EU. Mark has been in his job for about 2.5 years, and before that he worked as the EU Ambassador to the World Trade Organization. Today we will be talking about methane, but before we go there, Mark, could you tell us a little bit about your role so the audience understands what you are doing for the EU on climate diplomacy?
The EU Climate Ambassador is the person who is in charge of outreach to third countries to try and persuade them to enhance their climate action and ambition. We have a number of instruments for that. But in addition to the sort of mitigation dialogue, the climate ambassador also has to look into the geopolitics of decarbonization. What are the other challenges coming in our direction? Many countries that are fossil fuel economies will have to adjust. How can we help them? And then there is also the question of making sure that we have access to the raw materials that will be necessary to develop the green economy.
Thank you, and that is really important. It shows the story that we're talking about today in terms of methane. And I definitely would want to talk about the global methane pledge a little bit later. But it will also be interesting to hear a little bit about the journey that the EU itself has made on methane. Can you please tell us a little bit about that?
Well, with regard to a number of sectors, we have tackled the methane issue fairly early. It's now almost 20 years ago that we adopted the landfill directive, which has in a way dealt with the issue of methane in waste. Also in the field of energy, we took a number of technical measures. Moreover, we are now a very energy dependent economy. The lion's share of our energy is imported. So what we are left with is agriculture, where definitely there is more work to be done. Now, in October of last year, we came out with a new methane strategy. A methane strategy which is very much focused on energy, and energy produced in the EU, but definitely also consumed in the EU. That methane communication is now resulting in proposals for measures which should normally be adopted on the 14th of December, where we're going to set out a number of very concrete measures in the energy-related methane field.
Yeah, and that is really important news, because it's one thing to talk about tackling emissions, but it's a second thing, a really important thing, to put the legislation in place and to take action. You already mentioned that the EU is very much dependent on imported energy. Do you also see as a next step that the EU will consider reducing methane from imported emissions?
I think the first step, with regard to the measures that we're going to take, or at least propose on the 14th of December, one is very much concentrated on improved measurement, reporting and verification. In the methane field, also in the CO2 field, but also in the methane field, there are still quite a number of gaps of measurement. We want to tackle those inside the EU, but also outside. And we're going to work with industry so that we get a much better picture at company level on the basis of the voluntary oil and gas standards that a number of companies have already adopted. But you're right that measurement is one part of the story, but given the fact that we're now in the decisive decade for tackling climate change, we also have to put in place in parallel measures to discipline countries and companies with regard to energy-related methane, be it with respect to venting and flaring, or with the detection and repair of leaks in pipeline systems. That is very important for us because we have calculated that if you look at the methane emissions that are associated with the consumption of energy in the European Union, we are the biggest energy importer in the world, only 5% of the methane associated with our consumption takes place within the borders of the EU. The 95 other percent are related with extraction and transport of natural gas, oil and coal. And so we have to get also towards the producers of fossil fuels and tell them that they have to clean up their methane act. And so our longer term goal, which I hope is not going to be too long, should be to get into a dialogue with our suppliers, hopefully together with other energy consumers, so that we get to standards in the field of methane emissions in the countries that produce and transport and are the transit countries for fossil fuel supplies to the European Union.
And that is a really nice segue, isn't it, to the global methane pledge? Because I understand that the EU, in its methane strategy of last year, already referred to the fact that the dialogue between suppliers and imported is crucial. And so, could you tell me more how the global methane pledge came about? Because this is an important initiative between the EU and the US.
Indeed. I mean, so we started with this idea of trying to create alliances of enlightened producers and consumers with regard to methane associated with energy. We were working on that, and then there was a change in government in the US. The US is also very interested in tackling methane and said, why don't we broaden this to all three sectors? So not only energy, but also agriculture and waste. It was on that broadened basis that we then moved forward and came with the central objective of trying to develop a collective target of at least minus 30% in 2030 compared to 2020, as well as improved measurement by all the countries joining the pledge. Initially in June, we were 2.
Yeah.
In September, we were 11. And then we pulled out all the stops in order to get as many countries as possible on board. And yesterday, we ended up with 105.
Wow.
105, covering 70% of world GDP and 40% of methane emissions. There's still a number of big countries that are outside the pledge, but we have hope that sooner or later they will also come and join us, because methane is the cheapest and fastest way to slow down global warming.
Yeah, and this is really good news. 105 countries. So I really like to congratulate you and your colleagues and the US team as well for making this happen. It's incredibly important. This is a milestone, but we're not there yet. So what do you see as the next steps for the global methane pledge?
Yes, this is the end of the beginning. We now have a pledge, we have a text, but obviously you have now to make that come alive. What we have said in the pledge is that we're going to work with existing institutions. We're not going to create any new layer of institutions. There are already a number of very good organizations working on methane, but what was lacking was a big political catalyst to expedite the work on methane abatement. That is what the pledge was really about. So now we have to work with existing organizations. There is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. There is the Global Methane Initiative. We now have the IMEO that has been established a few last week actually in Rome. So we have a number of instruments. We have now to work with the philanthropies as well as the multilateral development banks that yesterday said they were going to team up with us. And then every year there will be a ministerial methane meeting to take stock of where we are compared to the objective of 2030. So that is now the sort of ingredients that are on the table. We've got to cook the meal.
Yeah, and you already referred to IMEO, and as an environmental NGO, we see that as a very important plank of the global methane pledge. And I understand that for you, that is also a very important element.
For us, this is absolutely crucial. One of the big handicaps of doing something about methane is that there is not adequate methane measurement that is then impartially vetted. So we need better measurement and we need impartial verification. Because often when you talk to countries and you tell them, listen, you have major methane leaks, they in a way shrug and say, well, what makes you say that? We have now a lot of technological progress in detecting methane leaks. We have the Copernicus program in the European Union that provides satellite pictures that give you very accurate spotting of methane. The IMEO will have to fill a void, and that is of reporting, systematic reporting and verification, such that we get an international database on methane emissions, which must be the first stepping stone towards doing something in a generalized way on methane abatement. So for us, IMEO is absolutely crucial, and we hope that many countries will join us in providing the necessary financial support. We gave already 10 million euros to IMEO, but clearly more will be needed. That doesn't need to be a financial contribution. You can also do a contribution in kind, but IMEO has to be given hands and feet.
So, well, for our audience, I mean, clearly an awful lot is happening. I think you mentioned before the meeting that your next sort of important next meeting where parties come together is next week on the 9th of November, is that right?
There is the Ministerial of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, where Executive Vice President Timmermans will speak, and where he will definitely focus a lot on the global methane pledge.
Yeah. Okay, so that is something to keep an eye on. I think we're sort of winding up our conversation now. Is there, as a last remark, anything else that you would like to say to the audience?
Well, I think there is now undisputably momentum behind methane abatement. We've got to seize that momentum and make sure that we get to the objective of minus 30%, at least minus 30% in 2030. For us, that will be working with energy suppliers, as well as get into higher gear with regard to methane emissions from agriculture. We talk a lot about that. It now really has to happen as well, in particular by way of technological scaling up of technologies that exist to reduce methane emissions in agriculture. That also has to happen now over the next few years. An awful lot is happening. We now have to translate that into a policy framework where then the science can be brought to the actual emissions.
Thank you. It's incredibly helpful to speak to you, and lots of success with your further work. Thank you.
Many thanks.
Okay.